such sights to show you.
Hey folks, it's just me today as Todd is feeling pretty sick. He's got a bad cold. So get well soon, Todd. Hope you get fixed up and back on track as soon as you can. So it's just me this week. I've got a great interview here with someone who is actually the first person that I ever got in touch with regards to makeup effects years ago. And I still have my letters from 1990 when Geoff Portass replied to my questions when I was just 16. I sent him all kinds of stuff. I sent some foam samples from some foam latex that I made at home with a handheld whisk. With this foam latex kit which I had, which was terrible, but I sent him a piece and I asked him questions about this and the makeup that they used, and through all these letters and things that I sent to him, he replied every single time, and I remember that, and I spoke to him about it and told him that, and it meant a lot to me, and it's one of the reasons why I feel so strongly about helping people when they have questions, because I know what it feels like when there's something you really want to know, and either you don't know how to articulate the question, or it's just something that you just can't find someone to answer. So I attribute that kind of thing to that feeling I had when I had these questions and he answered. It's amazing. I also remember actually meeting when I was at college. I went to Wimbledon School of Art years ago. I graduated in 95, so this would have been 92, 93 when I started. I remember meeting Nick Dubban, who came in, and he was teaching the prosthetics part of our course then, and I basically cornered him for about half an hour. He wasn't even teaching my class; he was teaching the year above, and I had all these questions I'd been reading, in Gorzone and Fangor, and I just accumulated all this information and all these questions, and I didn't know anyone. Bearing in mind this was pre-Google, I had all these questions and things I wanted to know. So I basically called him and said, "Oh, I've got these questions. Can I speak to you?" And he was, this was early '90s, so he was not that long after he'd done the Joker on Jack Nicholson for the first Batman. And he basically answered all my questions. It was amazing. And I just remember feeling like I came out walking on air after I'd spoken to him. He's had all these questions that had been burning a hole in my brain for years. And I didn't know anyone else that even knew what I was talking about, let alone who can answer my questions. So it was really, really cool. So to people like that who, took time to answer my questions and knew what I was talking about as well, it was a really cool thing, so I appreciated that. Anyway, so I drove up to Geoff's place and we chatted for a good few hours about stuff. And this interview with Geoff Portass, I had to split into two separate casts because we did so much chatting. There was so much material. And it seemed to fall into two logical topics. So the first part, which is this part, is all the film stuff. And the next part, part two, will be about the teaching stuff. So this is part one, which looks at the film stuff. And like I say, the next issue, the next episode will be next week. We'll be covering the next stuff. Just a quick mention of some new workshops, by the way, that I'm doing. I'm coming up at Pinewood in the next few months. So keep an eye out for announcements and dates on my workshop page of my website, which is learnmakeupeffects.com/workshops. That's where I'll be posting my stuff. There will be dates and booking info on there in the next few days. I haven't had time to update that yet because it's been crazy doing stuff. But I am doing some workshops people have been asking, so I shall be doing some soon. Okay, so let's go and chat with Geoff and discuss vaginas in throats, dildos on bedposts, and the other things that went into a movie that at one time may have been titled S&M Demons from Beyond the Grave. I think that may be a working title, or maybe that would have been a better one, but it ended up being called Hellraiser in the end. So let's go and chat to Geoff about that. How much time have you got to watch TV?
This is it. I want to retire so I can just watch a series a day or something.
Oh, God. Can you imagine? Then you would be binge watching.
But when I was a kid, that's why I got into movies, because when I was a kid, I watched films, and we didn't have video in those days.
Yeah.
So Christmas was when Christmas came early. So as Christmas came at Christmas, it was 5 films a day, and I'd map the radio times out so I could channel hop, and just if I knew a film, I'd just lose the and I'd watch films all day.
Yeah.
Now, of course, the thing is you can do it without that, and it's just a nightmare.
Yeah.
So, but I don't watch half as much TV as we used to. just don't.
So I basically just want to skim through a little bit about how you started out ended up doing what you did, and then we'll just talk a little bit about Image and the movies that happened and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I'm more interested in the like the monsters and the how things are created and that side of things. I don't want to pick apart business relationships, or I don't think anyone else is interested. It's more about the art of it, for want of a better word. I mean, I remember I got the book when it came out, with all the monsters in it and all these creatures
from Nightbreed.
And it was like, oh my god! And then I think the first time I'd seen the word prosthetic ever was reading a Gore Zone, I think it was, and there was an interview, and there was a guy with the hooks in his cheeks, and they did an interview with one of the actresses who'd done a painting that was one of the, I can't remember the girl that was in it, but anyway, it was all new to me, and it was like, oh, I didn't know what prosthetic was, and I looked it up in the dictionary, and whenever I'm talking to anyone that does it, I reflect in my head how I kind of crept into it, and reading magazines and slowly drifting towards it. But I don't know if your experience was the same, where you always like monstery things, or you like movies, or how you ended up doing it, or did you find yourself doing it?
No,
how did this happen?
No, okay. So I mean, the thing is, I always date myself. Is the thing is that I've said it before. Is the thing is that 1969, I was 9.
Okay.
Born in 1960. So I don't care anymore. The thing is, it's just sort of 1969, 2001 comes out.
Yeah.
And whilst I'd been, as a kid, I was interested in science fiction and fantasy and things like that. It's, when you're 8 or 9, you don't really do that much. But I'd read magazines and I'd started reading Arthur C. Clarke and things like that. So when 2001 came out, to me that was it. And that said, this is what I'm into. And even when I was 9, I understood the movie. Then I read the book, and then I understood the movie a little bit more, etc., and got into that. So what I started doing was just sort of like looking around at other things. And because the thing is, I'm from the generation that grew up with Hammer horror.
Yeah.
So the thing is, you go back to 57 for the Hammer horror, Frankenstein, etc., then the Draculas, and then all the way through the 60s into the late 60s and the early 70s, when they sort of fizzled out with the vampires thing, and the Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, that kind of stuff. And I got totally into it, so I started buying magazines and all the bits and pieces. And then I sort of got into the horror and the blood and guts, and threw a bit of blood around when I was a little kid, but most of the time I was just sort of like playing. And the one thing that I did that, for my eternal shame, was I bought Dick Smith's Monster Makeup Handbook. I've still got an original copy somewhere, an original sort of like first run copy or whatever, and copied some of the bits and pieces from that, and did a few things on. I'd sort of like do little acid burns on people, etc., and school friends and things and bits and pieces. And then I started sort of like sculpting heads on my Action Man. In blue tack.
Maquette.
In blue tack. Yeah. I copied Frankenstein's monster. I did a gory one. I did a mummy. And then I've still got the pictures somewhere in the back of Beyond. I've no idea where. But the thing is, I took pictures of them. This was about 11 or 12. Wow. And I sculpted and painted them in poster.
That's a really good idea.
Well,
it was the head's there. It's basically just modified.
And I just added to it and things like that. I chopped a few of his fingers off just for the effect, etc. And just did that.
This was when Action Man had like flocked hair?
Yeah, no, before flocked hair. Before, so he had the plastic hair, so it was easy to sculpt on.
Okay.
And blue tack's not the easiest stuff to sculpt in, but I didn't. Plasticine was too hard, whereas blue tack I could warm it up and stretch it across. And I started doing little effects. If you stretch blue tack, it cobwebs. I don't think you've ever tried it. It's really weird. Yeah. And I was doing little effects with that on people's skin and things. And I just played, and then got with Dick Smith, and then went through there, and then did art at school. So art was my big thing at school, and I was a trustee, so I could sit at the back, and I did a little bit of sculpting, but we didn't really do sculpting. It was more painting. Did my art O-level, and then in 77, when I was 17, so I had done my O-levels, I was doing my A-levels, and Star Wars comes out.
Yep.
So Star Wars was the big sort of like thing that kicked off the sort of science fiction revival, and then kicked into play all these, the Star Trek revival, Black Hole, all these kind of things around the late 70s. Yeah. And that was what really then kicked it off for me again. So I then applied to do a course, a graphic design course. And back in those days, before you were born, I still think.
I was 73.
73. So just
wasn't long behind
running around. But the thing is, it's just sort of that you didn't have all these courses like we have now. I mean, I think almost a slightly ridiculous number of courses, not just in makeup, but in art, in those terms, in the sense that you had 2 courses. You had fine art and graphic design, and that was it. And I've always said that the way you look at it is that fine art is your passion is from here, your heart. Graphics is here, your head. You're solving other people's problems.
Yeah.
So if somebody comes to you and says, I want to sell this product, I want to do this, I want to get this emotion across. As a graphic designer, that's what you do. And whilst I enjoyed doing a bit of painting, when I was 15 or 16, I sold a few paintings to people. Just, I put little ads in, say, I can do portraits and pictures of people's houses and things, and I did a few of jets of RAF Coningsby and things for people and made a bit of money out of it. But I never really did much else.
Right.
And so I thought, okay, look, I'm not really a fine artist. I'm not sort of, I didn't have that much teenage angst to get out onto canvas or whatever. So I did graphics, and I bypassed the foundation course, as they were then, which was the idea that you tried everything. But I went to Leicester, what was then Leicester Polytechnic, it's now De Montfort University, and I went there, and the guy said, oh, this is interesting, and they took me on straight off. Over 3 years, I did graphics, and halfway through the course, they changed. The head of school was fired for basically making sexual advances to some of the students, the female students.
That's not the right thing.
And they brought in a man called Peter Ray, who died last year from the Royal College of Art, and he was brilliant because he wanted to revolutionise and play. So when I showed him my pictures of all my plasticine dinosaurs and my little spaceships, I was into building. I was doing everything, not just makeup. So I was doing animations and I was building spaceships. I built a 4-foot-long spaceship model with all kit parts all over it and things, which I eventually sold to Central TV for one of their kids' TV shows.
Have you ever seen that?
Yes,
you have?
Oh, it was on TV 2 or 3 times in 2 or 3 little shows, yeah.
Oh my gosh, how cool is
and
that?
it took me about a year to build, and I could point out all the little bits of kits to you and stuff, I learned to airbrush and then add little bits and pieces and cut out little details and stuff, and loved it.
I bet you it's on eBay for millions of pounds now.
No, to be honest, it caught fire. They accidentally left it one place and it caught fire one day. They left it too close to a light, and it's long gone. But that was great fun. So the thing is, I did that, and this head of school saw it, and he said, "Well, why don't you do this?" I said, "Can I?" He said, "Yeah." So I spent the last year of my university course writing a thesis called Star Wars and the Renaissance of Science Fiction Cinema, talking about my love for 50s science fiction and then the working of science fiction back in the 70s when Star Wars started and comparing the two, and then finishing this model spaceship and doing what was called a tape slide. We didn't have all this video technology then, iPhones and stuff, and it was like a 2 slide projectors projecting dissolving images across. Okay. So I started off with a Star Wars flyover with a spaceship going with a big soundtrack. I got to do a 16-channel track mix in the sound studio we had there. We shot location work with some actors at Castle Donington Power Station with their control room standing in as the bridge of this ship. And then I airbrushed all the photos with stars and lasers and God knows what, and did a big 10-minute long little movie.
Wow!
Made out of coloured slides, which was sort of like, when you put it in the projection suite, it just knocked your socks off. It was fabulous. Did that. I did I'll show them to you at some point. I did a plasticine dinosaur thing with knocking down stones and stuff. Loads and loads of stuff. Came out with a first-class honours degree. And
you enjoyed. You had fun. You were just indulging in but working hard. But it was an indulgence. It was coming from here, not from here.
Exactly,
it's the heart,
and just loved it. Left that. Went to live in London, and that would have been in 1981. And then over the course of 2 years, did little jobs. I was taken on. I've got what apparently is a very, very good colour sense. If you show me a colour, I can mix a colour to match that colour, that of that wall or that one, virtually precisely. There's a colour test apparently where you put 100 coloured blocks out through from one end of the spectrum to the other, and I got 2 wrong.
Right.
And it's very, very small differentials. I think you see them on Facebook, these colour tests where you have to pick out the slightly. And I got quite high into the thing, so I could do that. And I got taken on Warner Brothers. Their shops in the high street would call me because they got these big fiberglass statues of Roadrunner and things. When they got damaged, they pay me £100 just to go in and sort of put a bit of car filler on and match the paint and just paint it over.
Wow.
I was on the dole, etc., etc. I was doing bits and pieces, small jobs here and there, etc., and things like that. And then one day, I then got. God, you really want to hear all this?
I do.
I then got right. I went down to the BBC and got offered an interview there.
Would this be down at BBC TV Centre?
Well, no.
It was
actually where London College of Fashion is now.
Oh, right.
It was still part of the BBC then.
How strange.
Or very close to it. And I got back on the train at Goldhawk Road,
right,
and I left my portfolio at the station. Got one stop along, went back, it's gone.
Okay.
And this was going to another interview. Then what was called, it was also called Alice and Bachelor.
Okay.
Remember Alice and Bachelor? They made the animated version of Animal Farm and various other things. Big animation, British animation studio back in the 50s and 60s. John Hallis then spoke to me before he died about a year later. He had a project and I did some storyboarding for him on it, which so he employed me off it. And I lied and said, the BBC wanted to keep hold of my portfolio, and luckily I had all the negatives and bits and pieces, so I was able to amass it. Never got it back. So that was that.
I mean, to have that crushing loss just before an interview as well, I mean, you've got to push that out of
and
your
I
mind.
actually put an ad in the Evening Standard saying, keep the portfolio, keep the leaves, just give me the photos.
Yeah.
So I was able to make it back up, and I got a little job out of that anyway. And I did little things, and then in 1983, looking at Screen International, I got in touch with a friend of mine, is a close-up magician called Faye Presto. Mm-hmm. And she was just doing the sort of small pub and club circuit at the time, and I made some props for her, a little collapsible fake skull, and
that's quite good because magic wasn't that big. I mean, it's bigger now.
It's
but
bigger.
It
She's still going now. She does lots of the big tour circuits now and things like that, and she's very, very good. Heavy duty close-up stuff. You look at it and go, and I helped make some props for certain gags. And she said, "Look, I've done a few jobs," and she was doing jobs for big film parties, and said, "Look, I've got some contacts." So she put me in touch with Gary Kurtz, producer of Star Wars.
Wow.
So I rang him.
That's a good contact to have.
For a start. I rang him and he gave me an interview.
Wow.
And he was producing Return to Oz at the time, this would have been 83, with Lyle Conway doing the head of the effects. So he took me along to meet Lyle. I spoke to him. They didn't have a job there or anything, and Dave White was there, and Steve Norrington, and various other people. And he interviewed and said, well, there's nothing really going on at the moment. So I sort of left and went and had a cup of coffee in the canteen. Looking at Screen International, noticed they were doing a film called Space Vampires, with Toby Hooper directing. Toby Hooper, you think, ooh. So I sort of found out, looked for Nick Maley. So I went to the front desk, said, you know where the workshop is? And they sort of directed me. So I went and knocked on the door. And Nick was there and had a chat with him. And Bob was sitting over there. Didn't know Bob at the time. And,
this is Bob Caine.
Bob Caine.
Yeah.
And he said, look, okay. He said, look, okay, we've got some work going for sort of starting sort of runner, bottom of the grade. So go away, come back in 2 days' time with some airbrush paintings of zombies. So I went home, no money, because I'm on the dole at this point, etc. So just sort of getting by, and didn't have an airbrush. So I cadged 50 quid off somebody to buy a little cheap airbrush, spent the next 2 days doing 2 or 3 airbrush paintings of zombies. Went back, they gave me a job. And I was there right till the end for about 6 months. And I ended up being Dan Parker's assistant on all the makeups, watching, I think his name was Jacques Benoit, airbrushing all the zombies, and he was a brilliant French, I think he's dead now as well, doing all the airbrush stuff. And there was Colin Arthur's mum, Dorothy, there doing sculpting bits and pieces. Dave White was on there, Dan Parker, trying to think who else, Bob Keane, Jill Hopper, who's now an exec producer at DreamWorks, etc., who's a very good friend over there. And I just got to watch everybody, and that's where I learnt so much. So I was holding Dan's glue pot, etc., while he was sticking bits on, and it was a nice process because it was a mix and match zombie process where they sculpted chins, cheeks, foreheads, noses, and we would get the extras in for a whole day, and we would literally lightly stick just say cheeks number 4 with chin number 2, nose number 7, etc. on the face, and you'd make a mask that would fit that person, then take it off, you'd prosode across the top, take it off, and then stick the whole thing properly together. So each person had, say, 6 or 7 masks that were made for them from generic parts.
And they're all different, even though you've sculpted a bunch of stock things. That's a great idea. And foam as well, so it would keep its shape.
Exactly.
It didn't sort of sag.
So we had a whole room with walls and walls of masks. So every time the people come in, Dan would get there, we'll do numbers. There was some continuity for certain gags, etc., and you can see them in the film. And then there was Dorothy doing her big bat creature, and then I got to... This is where I learnt to run foam latex, because I would stay late till every night running about 60 of these pieces. There were 6 moulds of each. I learned how to duplicate moulds. They're all plaster moulds. So I was doing clay press squash techniques to duplicate the moulds, doing 6 runs. It says 360 moulds every night to get foams out of. So I would be the last person there 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, 6 days a week.
It takes a while to run foam in plastic because you've got to slowly heat up and you slow down.
And this is how I learned how to run foam.
Yeah.
And
what studio was this? Where would you?
At Elstree.
At Elstree.
At Boreham Wood, it was big.
Yeah.
It was a big, fabulous
big
place
studio,
to work.
very important studio.
A lovely place to work. It was so nice. And because you could walk out and you were in the middle of a town.
Yeah.
So you had restaurants and cafes and banks and that all next to you.
You have a bit of life, you can go and sort your business out in the lunch hour.
And that was nice. So I learned how to do that, and they let me do some painting on stuff, and then they let me go on set and squirt blood on the extras, and then they let me start to stick a few pieces on. And that was my grounding.
Wow.
And this is where I sort of say to people today, is, you as a runner, don't expect to go in just and, nice big silicone piece and do a full face makeup straight off. This is where you learn stuff on the job. And that was brilliant. So after that, I'll just carry on if you want me to.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it was fascinating. Like you were saying, it is that thing of, I guess there wasn't an expectation then of what you could have been. I think some people might see extras on a DVD and think, oh, that's the thing I want, and they're not looking at how that's achieved. And it's knowing the nuts and bolts thoroughly well before you sort of.
Well, I think also you're looking at 83. It's only 6 years after Star Wars. You haven't even got Return of the Jedi out yet. They were shooting. What were they? They were shooting. Because they were shooting Return to Oz at the same time, which is a fabulous movie.
Yeah.
The claymation, the make, I love that film. It's a beautiful film. And Steve Norrington's little chicken, which is just awesome. But the thing is, it's just there wasn't as much going on then. And so people didn't know about it like they do now.
Yeah.
And everybody wants to do it. And yes, you say, I want to work in films because you think it's glamorous, and you know it's not. It's sitting around on your backside for 20 hours over the day, etc. And it's intensely boring. It can be soul-destroying. It can be awful. It can be wonderful.
It is. And that's just the set stuff. There's also the kitchen area, where you're making stuff and sculpting stuff and
endless days, and sometimes 20-hour days, 6 days a week, working through the night to get something done because of bastard producer says he wants this tomorrow instead of Thursday, and it's a nightmare. And then everybody else has opinions. Every cleaner or suit that comes in has an opinion. It says, so you've got to change this for that. Then there are mistakes made, and it's just. And there's fabulous times to that, and there's awful times to it.
There is, but you've got to love the processes.
Yes,
and what's required of you. If you don't love that part of it, you're not going to get through all that.
And I think as well, you've got to love the final product.
Yes. And
that's why I got into it, because I loved watching films. When I was a kid, I was saying earlier, but when I was a kid, we didn't have video. Crikey, colour TV only came in 1969 when I was 9. I remember we had the first colour TV in the street because my dad worked at Rent-A-Vision or whatever it was. And so we had the first big 18-inch colour TV in the street. And we were sitting going, oh, and that was it. So the thing is, it's just sort of like, I used to watch movies when there were lots of movies on. We used to have Saturday afternoon cinema instead of football. And we didn't have all these, we had 3 channels. Until 1982, it was 3
Channel
channels.
4 came along, that was a big game changer.
And the thing is, so I used to watch films when I could. And so all those those Saturday and Friday night Hammer horror films, then the thing is, I used to watch those. So you looked at Roy Ashton's, you look at Curse of Frankenstein, great movie, gorgeous Technicolor, Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee. But you look at that makeup and you can see that half of it's wax that's peeling off on scars that you could put your finger under the edges and things like that. But it's a classic. Yeah. You look at Dracula and you look at the red paint for blood spattered everywhere and things like that. Yeah,
that bright red.
And you look at it and you think, wow, what must it look like in the real world? Because now we've got all this fabulous HD of whatever grade. The thing is that then it was through film, through Technicolor film, so it would have looked even worse on the set. But this is what got me into it, and that's why I thought I love watching movies. That's why I enjoyed doing it. So I mean, after that, we then, I got on reasonably well with Nick. He's a nice enough bloke, and Bob especially, and Dave Keane was there, etc. And we did a couple of other small projects, and then Highlander came along, and we did Highlander. Nick vacated the place halfway through Highlander. Suffering nervous exhaustion, and just had to have Bob finish off the film. And I was sort of like Bob's sort of right-hand man at that point. And when that finished, we just sort of ensconced to Shepperton and a tiny little workshop in Shepperton Studios, and did a couple of bits and pieces, did some props for various little films and little TV shows and things, but nothing much. just sort of
How was your experience in Highlander? Was that a fun job? Do you remember?
It was
as a fun time or not? Really?
No, it was good fun. I mean, Russell is a fabulously creative person. His mind wanders, shall we say, in a nice way. Mm-hmm. But I think he just sort of like the problem with Highlander and most of Russell's films is its style over content. Mm-hmm. He's more interested in getting a fabulous shot. If that shot doesn't fit in with the rest of the film, well, somebody else can sort that out. And that was when Highlander 2 went completely to pot. Yes. And you don't know what was done before they made the corrections to the errors. It was a nightmare. Highlander was fabulous. There was 2 weeks up in Scotland, which was interesting. Just sort of spending 2 weeks on a battlefield with lots of blood and guts and lots of very big, angry, often drunk, sort of like Scottish people. But it was interesting. It was good fun.
Yeah,
it was good fun. But unfortunately, sort of like Nick lost out on that. So we finished that off and did a few bits and pieces. And it was good fun. And it's a fabulous movie. It's dated a little bit. But there's some stylish. It's very, very stylish. So all those lovely scene changes, cutting through from the car park to the lock and things.
Yeah.
It's a very, very stylish film. Unfortunately, the acting is not wonderful in some of the
No, but it was quite unique at the time as well.
Fabulous.
I mean, it wasn't anything real like that.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I didn't know how to take it when I first saw it. I was quite young when I saw it, but it is.
But that's its strength. Is the thing is, it doesn't feel like it has to explain itself.
Yeah.
And then, of course, unfortunately, they went on to do Highlander 2, which we're also involved in, that tried to explain why you'd have something called the Cloud on a planet at the other end of the galaxy is it's mind-bogglingly ridiculous, and it was awful. It was a nightmare. Apparently, Connery refused to sign the contract until he'd rewritten half the script, and yet it was still the biggest pile of poo you've ever seen in your life. And then they ran out of money, and they couldn't make certain scenes join up. So if you really watch that film, you'll see something happening, and then all of a sudden it's 2,000 miles away.
Wow!
And it just makes no sense whatsoever.
You see this editor somewhere tearing their hair out, trying to go, how am I going to make this work?
It's awful. But still, Highlander we finished, and then this man called Alan Jones turned up. Do you know Alan?
No.
You'd know him if have you ever been to Fright Fest? He organised
a long time ago.
He organises Fright Fest. Tall guy, balding, like us, etc., etc. And he used to do things like writing the backs of video covers and writing for Fango, Gorezone, all these kind of things. And he just turned up one day and sort of and we'd known him because he was the publicity. He was doing publicity on Highlander. And he said, I've got this friend who sort of like has got a budget to make a low-budget horror film. Would you be interested? And he sort of took us to meet Clive, and that was it.
This being Clive Barker.
So we all went down to Crouch End, to Clive's house in Crouch End, and he outlined Hellraiser for us and said it's a low-budget film. They're paying me a pittance, which was a serious pittance in those days, what they paid him, and said, this is the budget we've got, would you be interested? And we said, yeah, because it just sounded so fascinating. I'd never heard of the man. So I went and read the books of Blood and Damnation Game. That was the only, I think, novel he got out at the time. I thought, this is fabulous stuff. So we just took that on, and then that made a little bit of history, and that was fabulous. I still look back as Hellraiser was, the most enjoyable sort of time of my life, sort of in films. Because the thing is that we're all reasonably young. This was 85, so I was 25. And I know Bob got a bit of reputation for employing perhaps far too many young people as sort of a bunch of kids who
had you set up in Image Animation by now?
Yes, sure. We'd set up. Image Animation was born sort of when we moved off Highlander, and we just called it that, and that was it. And it was about a year later we then got stuck into Hellraiser. Mm-hmm. But we moved to a bigger workshop in Shepperton that Dan Parker then took over for animated extras.
Yes, I know. Building 19, I think, was that room's got some history in it.
Yes, yeah. And it was just good fun. And then we got Nigel Booth joined us at the end of Highlander, so he came in for Hellraiser, and David Elsey, he started there as well, and Little John, and Simon Sace, all these people, people, and it's just we just had the time of our life, because although it wasn't a mega budget, we were all paid reasonably well, and we had a laugh, and it was just working on something that you knew was creative, because it's Clive,
and you didn't know, like you never do when you work on something, you don't know what you're making, you don't know how it's going to go down.
I got the lead Cenobite, so fine, okay. And Clive, I saw one drawing. There's so many drawings more popped up now that I honestly never saw these drawings. There was one drawing that was a very tribal thing with spikes coming out of his head, and I changed it to nails, or pins at the time, so to speak, and then designed the makeup and made it geometric, and then I also designed the second stage of Skin Frank. The first stage was David Elsey. The second stage was the first makeup, and then Cliff Wallace did the third stage with makeup built on top of my makeup, so we could just add pieces to it, so it was just all doable. And we just had a great fun time. The money seemed to sort of just keep coming, so there was a reasonable budget for it for what it was. And then we moved up to Cricklewood and shot the whole film in Production Village there, and in the house just around the corner. And we had a great time because all the Cenobites were played by Doug, Nick and Grace for the first film, and Simon Bamford, who all knew Clive from his old production days, of the theatre company days, I can't remember the name of the company. And Doug was one of Clive's oldest friends. And so we got on with them, we enjoyed ourselves, and it was a good laugh, and we just worked, we were young, we worked ourselves to the bone like you do, but had a laugh. And at the same time thinking, this is really weird, you've got dildos on posts and all this kind of stuff, and just weird things. And Clive said, no, go to town on it, vaginal openings in throats, make it sexual, and make it like these things you sort of think, well, I don't know, do I want to know? Ooh, what? Yeah, ooh, oh. And
I just love the idea of, them saying, like, make it sexual. You're like, oh, you want it to be saucy? No, I actually want vaginas and throats.
Yeah, that was the whole thing. John, because John sculpted it on the first, Butterball. I mean, when he's sitting there, he's got this slit that he's sitting there, playing with. It was always, Clive, you read Clive's stuff, it's always very sexual.
Yeah, it always ends up with lots of shagging and blood and the big monster.
So he said, go for it. He said, I want these. I mean, there was always the original title, Hellraiser, a love story. And then you go back to S&M Demons from Beyond the Grave, which is what you wanted to call it originally, but it was just too corny and just too silly, and it wouldn't have worked. But the idea was to call it Hellraiser, a love story.
Wow.
Because it is a love story. It's the story of a woman who, will kill for the best fuck she's ever had, basically. And, this was the love of her life, who turns up as a sort of a skinned corpse and says, if you kill men, it'll grow me back again. And she wants that sex again. She wants that love again. And that's exactly what it is. It's a classic Hollywood love story, which is why I saw it again a couple of years ago as a showing of the first two. And it's got, it's a low-budget film, that awful dubbing that New World did afterwards to sort of relocate it to the States, even though it's blatantly England. But the thing is, there are certain genius touches, the bit when they've had their first sex, he's still skinned, and there's him smoking a cigarette. Yeah. And the audience every time laughs, and it's this nervous laughter of, hang on, post-coital cigarette, but no skin. Oh, God, she's just, oh. Yeah. And she's that desperate to have sex that she'll have sex with him without her skin. And but you believe it because it's Clay Higgins and all that, and he just got these good actors, and it was just wonderful. But nobody knew what we were doing at the time. We were sitting in a garage at the back of Cricklewood, Production Village. Do you know Production Village? No. It's a small lake with two bars either side and a small shooting studio. It's not a soundstage. So there's the classic stories. The thing is that they had a third assistant director who would wander out and stand by the pond because the ducks wouldn't quack when there was somebody standing there. And you could hear, like we did just now, you could hear ducks quacking in the background, so you'd have to go and stand outside. One day, he actually had to go out of the studio, walk all the way around the block, to knock on the door of people who were having a row in the house, the other side of the studio wall, to sort of like say...
Could you keep it down, please?
So, sound
trying
stuff,
to make a classic horror movie.
But we just sat there in this tiny little garage with the sort of like Nigel Booth did Chatterer. That's it. And then Little John did Female Sound. I did Doug, and Cliff Wallace did Butterball. And we were sitting there, and then there was Paul Catling there doing Skin Corpses and Bits and Pieces, and the engineer, the big creature.
Yep.
And we were crammed into this place, and every now and then you'd hear this beep, beep, beep of a lorry reversing back, delivering beer. And it was
a bar
weird.
or to...
There's two bars in Production Village. Right. It is essentially an entertainment complex where they had bands on in what we were shooting for the sound stage.
I thought you were going to say that Clive has a big drink thing and he just wanted beer delivered on set.
And it was weird. And then we shot in that house around the corner that was fabulous. And we would just sit there and we were having a laugh. And, we all smoked in those days, etc. And Doug smoked, so I would have, I'd have Doug's cigar holder with his little fag in because he couldn't smoke because he had prosthetics on, etc., etc. Sort of like standing there waiting for him. And we just set up this relationship that worked.
Wow.
And we just had a brilliant, brilliant time. We worked loads of hours and just didn't know anything about it. And then it must have been towards the end of it when they'd started to cut it together that New World came back and said, we quite like what you're doing here. And they
Pleased to
gave
hear
us, they said, we want to enlarge upon it. There's certain bits that originally you never saw Frank being reformed from the floorboards.
Yeah.
You'd simply just sort of see the blood dripping on, and then all of a sudden you'd cut to the sort of like the skin corpse grabbing him. So they said, we're going to give you some more money. And that's where the engineer came from the end. Not wonderful, but it worked to a certain degree, and they wanted a monster. And we had the whole Birth of Frank sequence that David Elsey then designed that stage one thing for, with all the sort of melting, the reverse melting techniques.
All practically, techniques,
practically all old school, sort of like a wax heart that you melted and reversed it, and loads of reverse shots of all the blood coming out the floorboards and things. And did all that, and then did a little extra rat sequence. We had to. Do you know the story about the rat?
No, tell me about that.
We had problems with the BBFC, as they were at the time, with the censorship and with the blood and guts. And so there was this old idea that if you actually went in with, Clive sort of said, if we make it really hyper gory, then the thing is that when they cut it, we get a lot more of the gore left in, because they'll think they've taken all the heavy duty stuff out, and we still get some nice stuff in. So, for instance, when Prudo, the first victim, gets killed, he deliberately shot it, and it was not nice to watch, because when she whacks him with that hammer, in the original cut, you see 5 blows to the head, and by the last one, he's crying, and it's really quite upsetting. And they cut it down to 2 blows for the original. The BBFC took about 3, and that was always sort of intended. But there's the classic story of when you see the rat nailed to the wall, because Frank nails the rats to the wall to keep them quiet, to stop the others coming up to discover him up there. And there's a shot of a wiggling rat on the wall nailed to the wall. And Bob had to take the animatronic rat down to the BBFC to show
prove
them
that it was not a real rat.
He did take it down there, I know that part's true. But whether that was just a publicity thing as well, we'll never know.
Oh my gosh.
But, and so they gave us this extra money, and then, when did Hellraiser come out? 85, 86, whatever it was. That was it. It was totally just sort of like, it was this big success.
Yeah.
All of a sudden we had the front covers of Time Out and all this. We had displays in Forbidden Planet Bookshop. And we were just doing makeups and signings and all this kind of thing.
And very, very iconic image, the whole pinhead thing.
And all of a sudden this makeup that I'd just been given the lead Cenobite, and even as Doug said, I remember Doug going on the set the first line he ever has, the first line he shot in the film was where Kirsty comes up to the loft and sees the skinned Frank, but it's actually it's her father, and she thinks it's her father, but it's not, it's actually Frank. And Pinhead points down and goes, "We want the man who did this." And Doug hated that, because he looks back and goes, "We want the man who did this." And it sort of becomes too different. It almost becomes comic. And he said, "I wanted to redo it again," and that was the first thing he ever shot. But the thing is, it's just sort of like, we had all those things there. It became silly. And we had about 8 lines in the film, and he just thought, let's just walk away and do that. And of course, he then did 10 films after that.
Yeah.
And it just became, all of a sudden, he was getting rung up for interviews, and I was getting rung up for interviews, and I was doing stuff on Radio 4 and kids' TV shows and things like that, and it's just silly. And then they go and do Hellraiser 2.
Suck it up, man. It's all good.
Yeah. So, we did a couple other films. We did Waxworks, I think, between it. Mm-hmm. And then we moved to Pinewood to do Hellraiser 2. We did a couple of other small bits and pieces, and then did Hellraiser 2. And in the meantime, Bob was then working in California doing a few other things, so I took over the running and ran Hellraiser 2.
Wow.
Which we did at Pinewood with a reasonably expanded budget, and Tony Randall directing, who I still speak to Tony a lot these days, and just had a reasonably good fun time.
Yeah.
Sort of like, it was one of those odd things that, I think Rick Baker always said, is the things that no matter how much money they give you, you will always run out of money. The effects, you will always be creative, and the effects will then
you expand. You grow to fill your boots, don't you?
And then you want more afterwards to make it better. So we did some big things, and there were some big sets, and we hoisted Caine Cranham up on a head loft and ripped his neck and God knows what else, etc. And it's not the greatest film, but I swear, it's watching it again, I'm thinking, a little bit, and it's just a bit corny in places. But there are people who revere that film these days who think it's better than the first one.
But there were some lovelies. I mean, that Kenneth Cranham bit with the wires across the face.
With the wires, yeah.
I mean, that's just really
Well,
nice.
you've seen the Memories of Image page on Facebook and things.
That's a great, it's a great.
And they're actually doing that. I've just actually sent off all that footage that I took on the video camera of all the makeup room footage from Hellraiser 2. I've just sent off to some people in the States, because the production company's doing a Blu-ray of Hellraiser 2, and they want to put a lot of that footage onto the making of, which comes out, I think, at the end of this year or something.
And isn't that nice? I mean, there weren't people desperately keen to have everyone sign non-disclosure agreements and keep all this stuff away,
Yes.
Because the thing is,
Well,
a
that
lot
was
of that
then.
stuff they don't do anything with, even if they
Exactly.
prevent you. You know?
So, I just wandered around with a video camera, and I could do it at 3 o'clock in the morning. So he got dug in his little leotard with his cigar in the holder and his glasses being propped up on his nails sticking out of his face, doing a little dance, with his red nose on for Red Nose Day, And it's just silly stuff and awful quality because it was, just video cassette in those days.
Yeah.
And it was good fun. It was some long days. There was some certain problems with certain members of the crew. I had to sack my first people and things like that, but you just do it.
Man, heavy is the head of he who wears the crown.
But I enjoyed
put
it,
up
and Rick Baker got out of the business because of the sort of the business part of it, because as he said, he sat in an office all day and didn't get to sculpt.
Yeah.
And I found out, certainly on Nightbreed later, but on Hellraiser 2 as well, the thing is that I was often just sort of sitting in an office, signing checks and making decisions and doing this, and then say overseeing that. Oh, then so-and-so wants a meeting with that. And then when everybody had gone home at the end of the day, I would spend a couple of hours doing some sculpting.
Yeah.
Because
I know people who do that now. I know like Niels does that and Barry Gower as well. It's like, they've got to run the business, and then when the phone stops ringing, it's like they'll stay for a few hours.
And I love the delegation part, and I love sitting down with a group of people and the designing part and stuff, but at the same time you do want to sit down sometimes and just sculpt or paint something.
Yeah.
And that's the horrible part of it. And so I know exactly where they are all coming from totally.
Sure.
So as long as you got certain things. So I took on 2 major makeups.
Wow. How big was your crew at this time? How many people would you say you had working for you on the second Hellraiser?
I'd say about 15.
Okay.
About
That's quite a big crew.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, I'd say 10 to 15 at tops when we really got going, because we sort of had all the corpses to make for the corpse scenes. We had, lots of interesting things.
And it wasn't like an established thing. You had like Henson's and maybe that's it, really.
SFX UK ran sort of like makeup crews when they did more makeup-y type things.
Yeah.
But they were more of a physical effects, the core bolts, etc., and things like that.
You were still trying to figure things out. It wasn't,
So, we'd got this big workshop at Pinewood that became our bigger workshop when we expanded for Nightbreed. And we just carried on from there. So I then sort of like sculpted the channel makeup. I thought, I know, to make it easier, I'll do it as a full overhead mask.
Okay.
Which was the silliest thing I ever did in my life.
Why so? Because it just became too unwieldy?
No, because the thing is, I know we went back to masks a little bit with silicone, but we've now almost gone back a little bit to pieces because they are easier to apply.
Yeah.
Because if you have a full overhead mask, getting the brush inside certain places to make it stick is a nightmare. Yeah. Now with silicone, they went on to that thing where I think Neil was doing where you'd put sort of AB silicone mix over the head, put the mask on, you'd have 10 minutes to squidge it around and then do the edges with your Telesis or whatever. But the thing is with foam, you're stuck with either your Prosaid or your Telesis or what we had, Dow Corning, that kind of stuff. Yeah. And if you get it wrong, it's a nightmare.
Yeah.
So I would put the mask on, and you had the wires, of course. So we had the wire. We designed it with these wires sort of coming down, pulling into. We had the elastic wires, which we did loads of all these tests of pulling them onto people's faces, and they would ping and do all the wrong things. And we got it to work, and it was all working quite. We had a little rig that somebody was pulling the wires tight. They weren't elastic; they were real wires. And as it went back, somebody was pulling each individual pair of wires. So as it went around Ken's face, they all stayed tight, and it worked beautifully. But you then had the wires on the makeup, and I thought, well, if I do a circle of wire, if Ken loses a bit of it's not quite in the right place where the makeup is or whatever, it's going to be loose. So I thought there've got to be a separate end. So I basically did a full overhead mask with a slot at the back, and then had a separate piece that stuck over the top. So the thing is, you put the mask on, then get it all glued down, painted up, put the wires on, little tacks of super glue just to make sure they're nice and tight, and then put this last piece on over the back that made it look like the wires were digging into the back of his brain.
Okay.
And you never really much saw the back of his head anyway, so it didn't really matter. And it worked to a certain degree. It's just that horrible thing, when you've got eye holes and mouth, and you're having to get the glue, and you got the process. It worked. It stayed on, but I wouldn't do it again. But Ken was a joy to work with. I'd known him as an actor, watching him on TV sometimes, and it was fabulous. And so we thought, fine. And I started at the beginning of the schedule. David Barron was our production manager. I mean, he's gone on to big, big, big things as a production manager, coordinator, producer, whatever. And I said to him, do Channard and Pinhead ever shoot on the same day? And he said, there's only one scene where they actually get together, where he comes through and Channard turns Pinhead back into the army officer. And he said, we've got one day for that. I said, okay. So I thought, I'll do it. I can do 2 makeups in one day, just for one day, no problem at all.
In the interest of saving budget, or just the hubris of being able to do it?
Well, I'd sculpted it, and I sort of thought, no, I was young, stupid, whatever. I don't know. I thought I can do it one day. It became 2 days. I said, but it's Monday and Thursday, so I've got time to recover between.
Okay.
I said, all I can do is I can have a separate assistant on each one. I had Roy for Pinhead and Steve Painter for Chanard. And I said, can you give me one promise? Can you stagger them? So I do one first, and then I have a little break, and then do the other one afterwards. And my assistant's going to finish off bits, and I can bit-bop in the same makeup room. So I said, yeah, no problem. So we get to the Monday. Doug's in at 3 o'clock in the morning, 3:30 start the makeup. About sort of 3 hours worth of makeup, sort of 6:30. Ken rolls in about 6 o'clock. And then I'm finishing Doug off saying, right, okay, you do that. So then I move over. Steve's then helping me. He's perfectly good at doing what he's doing at that point. It's one of his first jobs. Sort of helping me stick the makeup on, so I'm sticking that on, etc. Just, oh yeah, no, don't do that. Oh yeah, and just watching Doug's then finish, quick checks, yeah, okay, you can go. Then somebody else goes out to set with him, Roy possibly, but one of the other makeup artists goes out. Little John will look after him. I finish off Ken. So overall, I'm looking at an 8-hour makeup for two people, both falling asleep, etc., etc. We get to the end of the day, they haven't done the shot. I will do it tomorrow. I'm thinking,
that's not an unusual thing for me to hear.
So Thursday's pieces become Tuesday's pieces.
Yeah.
So I get home, I get both makeups taken off, them not having shot. I get home about 11 o'clock, and we say, okay, tomorrow I'll do the 2 makeups. We do them the other way round, because it sort of didn't really matter which one was on first.
Sure.
So we do them the other way round, and we get through the end of the day. They go on with Steve and somebody else onto the set, waiting to be shot. I run back into the workshop, pre-paint another set, or I think there's one set pre-painted for another day future, and nail that up ready for the next day, or for Thursday, which is still coming, with my day off in the middle. They get to the end of the day, and guess what? They didn't shoot it. We'll do it tomorrow.
What are they shooting at this point where they can afford to push 2 actors like that to one side?
Oh, no, they're all particularly big as such. End of Tuesday, Ken is saying, please, can we shoot? Because I'm so into this character, I don't know what these, but... So we do Wednesday. And so I do the same thing on Wednesday. And then, of course, we shoot Thursday as planned. So I do 2 3-hour, 3.5-hour makeups enlarged, so 8 hours of makeup application essentially, from really about 3:30 in the morning to about 11:30 in the morning, 4 days in a row, and I'm just knackered.
Yep.
And they said we're on set. I finally went on the set on Thursday afternoon because there was nothing else to do, thankfully. And I'm sitting there and I looked at my hand and I went, I can't stop my hand shaking.
Shakes, yeah.
And so John said, little John said, and Ken Cram said, they said, look, you're knackered. Look, there's a piece of foam, like the foam roller, sort of like something, whatever, in the costume. Go have a nap for a couple of hours. We'll if there's any problems, we'll get you, but just have a nap. The next thing I know, I'm being kicked. And it's Ken Cranham, out of makeup, it's midnight, and he's saying, we're all going home now, Geoff, are you done? And I've fallen asleep, just gone to sleep for 8 hours solid. And he'd used me as a footrest while they were taking the makeup off.
You had no idea.
That was it, I had no idea. So...
Did you get credit for that?
No. It was interesting. I was too, young, naive, I don't know, I wouldn't do it again. But the thing is, it's just there weren't as many people around then. But, and the film came out and it did reasonably well, and they went on to another, 9 sequels, I think, that just disappeared in that awful Hellraiser 11. But by that point, of course, I'd left Image, so we carried on from there. That was 80, 87, 88. And then we did Nightbreed.
Now, Nightbreed I want to talk about, because Nightbreed was probably the movie that switched me on more. Fangoria was going crazy for it, and it was one of the... There weren't that many movies with a lot of creatures, certainly in England. Although it was, shot in England. I mean, it didn't feel like an English movie.
No,
but because of it happening at Image, I was aware of all that kind of stuff. And that, there was a lot of stuff on that, and the people you get in at Image. I mean, I think a lot of people have to appreciate the alumni of people that came through Image. It's like a who's who of British makeup effects.
Yeah.
I mean, if we just go through some of them, like Neil Gorton. Did he start on Nightbreed? Do you think for you?
Yes.
He wasn't on the Hellraiser 2. I have to ask him.
He
was. Yeah. I mean,
no, he wasn't. No, he wasn't on Hellraiser 2. He did Nightbreed, then he did Lair of the White Worm with us. That was it. I'm pretty sure he started on Nightbreed.
And then Mark Coulier as well.
Mark Coulier had started before. Mark Coulier was on Hellraiser 2 and had started on the original Waxworks, and then Paul Jones, who's now working in Canada. We had Tom Loughton, who was his first English job.
Yep.
I think he came over and did the little creature there. I can't remember the name of it, but the little girl that turns into the creature.
Mm-hmm. Sean Harrison. Stuart Conran.
Yeah.
Chris Halls.
Or
Cunningham.
Chris Cunningham, yeah. Stuart Conran, I mean, this is the weird thing, you see. I know all these people when they were sort of like, virtually school kids. I mean, Chris Halls, who just looks... When you see him these days, he doesn't make much of appearances these days, does he? But the thing is, he's sort of like grungy still. I mean, he was this sort of like 15, 16-year-old young man in his very smart little tweed blazer with his parents sitting in the car waiting outside to take him home.
Yeah.
And he was a genius then. So you could, Chris Fitzgerald.
Yep.
Do you know? Yeah. Yep. And he started there. He brought in these beautiful dioramas that we just said, "Oh my God, these are gorgeous." Who else? I'm trying to think.
You said Mark Crane, I think you mentioned that. But and what's good is that some of these people have gone on to do amazing things. I mean, Mark Coulier's Oscars,
double Oscar winning. Yeah.
Neil Gorton,
Gorton,
that's spectacular, and Chris Cunningham now, mainly
directing,
known for doing Bjork videos and Square Pusher and Madonna and Aphex Twin videos and.
Yeah.
So you had a good eye, obviously, for staff because you got some good people in.
No, they were cheap, which is true to a certain degree. It's the thing is that Nightbreed, for all its, I think we had pushing about £1 million for the effects budget, which was enormous.
Yeah.
But when you look at what we had to do and what we did, it wasn't. So the thing is that, I mean, whether we were right or wrong, I think we had sometimes a reputation for taking a load of school kids on set who would trip over things, etc., etc. But then again, I think the film industry has a certain reputation for having boring old smart asses who've been there years, etc., etc., who think they know everybody's job backwards and all that kind of thing. So there was a bit of both sides. But we had this young, fresh, creative input, and we didn't employ them because they were cheap. I think as far as I remember, we paid everybody a reasonable wage, at least certainly the going rate, and we had a lot of fun.
Well, it was obviously a rate enough for them to take the job, otherwise they would have done it.
That they lived off it, etc., etc. I'm sure a lot of people would have complained and all that kind of thing, Yeah. And David Elsey on Nightbreed? No, he wasn't. David Elsey was on Hellraiser, and I think he did Hellraiser. I can't remember Hellraiser 2 or not. But the thing is, it's just we started off all these people, and the thing is that I'm not saying they wouldn't have got a job elsewhere. But as you said before, it was us and Henson's mostly. Nick Dudman was sort of like, but he hadn't got sort of the big organisation set up at the point of certainly Hellraiser 2.
Mm-hmm.
So we just sort of said, look, if you think you can do this, we'll guide you through it, etc. We'll organise, we'll run it, we'll pay you, we'll get the materials sorted. And these people were doing it. And by this point, the industry had taken off that little bit more, that people coming to us with a little bit more knowledge than certainly when I'd started, and back in the sort of 70s and stuff, than most people had.
Mm.
So they were slightly more au fait with sort of foam latex or principles and processes because of things like, remember the tech log in Gorezone?
Mm-hmm.
That Caglione and Drexler did.
Oh, I've got a lot of those.
Oh, I've got them all. I've got Fangor and Gorezone from number 1 onwards, still with all the posters in.
You should have told me that.
They're worth a small fortune. They are not here.
I think they should do. I wanted a campaign Starlog to try and reprint just the Caglione and Drexler Labs as a book, because they would make such an interesting article.
Well, I still use them. There was a fabulous thing. Crystal is not that much used these days, but we still use it at London College of Fashion because it's a good basic and it's cheap. And when you've got students who haven't got a lot of money, the principles, when I teach now, and we'll perhaps talk about it later, I teach on principles that that a mould made from crystal or resin or fiberglass or whatever, the principles are still the same.
Yes.
The keys, whether it's bolted, whatever. And the cutting edges, all those things, they still stand today. The same principles I learned nearly 30-odd years ago, they still stand.
Yeah.
So if you can make a mould out of Crystal, as long as you then learn the ins and outs, the technical difficulties, the dangers of some of the other materials, then you should be okay. So the point is that sort of like Cagliari and Drexler did a lovely thing, and Christa Cowell also to get. I took my
versatility. Thy name be plaster.
Yes,
I remember that very
and the
feature.
thing is, it's just the thing is, you mix it to a certain way, and then it gets thicker, and you do something with it. It gets a bit thicker. It gets cream cheesy, as I always say, and then you build it, and then it gets and so on.
That's
and so
right. And they
forth.
build this tower, don't they? Out of
and you remember
dollops.
It well. Yeah. And I say to them, look,
with a clock, so you could see the duration.
And I will do it for them sometimes. So look, this is how it works. If you know how your material works and how long it's going to take, if you mix it, I say with cold water. Some people say hot, but I say cold because then you know it's always going to be the same every time.
Yeah.
So the thing is, you say, look, put a blob there, walk away, do this. Now, if I shake the table, it will go blur. But if you leave it, it will set by itself a little bit, even while the stuff in the bowl is still liquid. So I put the blob on top. And I will build them that sort of 8-inch tall tower out of the same batch of plaster. And so as long as you know how it works, this is how it does. And all that stuff was in that tech thing in Cagliari and Drexler, in Gorzone. And they were brilliant because nobody else is doing that.
Yeah, no one was breaking that down. I love that about them.
Exactly.
I thought it was fantastic.
And it's my big gripe of some of the makeup magazines that you get these days. Thankfully, Neil has now done his thing, which is technical stuff.
Yeah, really drills down to
exactly.
The
but
nuts
that's
and
a
bolts.
technical magazine. Things in there, but I want to know far more detail, far more pictures than they've got.
Yeah.
And yes, the digital magazines do it, and Neil's magazine, and this is what we want.
Yeah.
And the makeup shows and all that. So you've got now, with all these courses and things, you've got all this stuff there to hand.
Yeah.
But we just sort of like, it's just mainly learnt it ourselves from magazines. So the thing is that we were still using plaster moulds in those days and a bit of fiberglass for the big pieces, but it was mainly Crystal.
Yeah.
And you know the ins and outs of Crystal. You run a foam latex mould in Crystal, 10 runs,
yeah,
and it's
flaking
really
and
starting to break down.
Yeah.
So the thing is that, I'm teaching people how to duplicate with clay squeezes, or we're taking silicons off and doing duplications from that, and it's not the easiest thing in the world. So with Nightbreed, with those creatures, I think at a count there are about 200 individual creatures in that film.
Wow. So like a condensed, all the things you'd need to know, like, making molds last, being able to reproduce them, being able to store loads of pre-made pieces and applications and overlapping creatures. All that happened in one movie. I mean, it's a real good training ground.
And we were doing basics. We were throwing stuff. I mean, the thing is that I did Baffa, the Baffa May makeup because I was running so much, because you can't. So I did this nice makeup, which I was quite pleased with, on this this big 6 foot tall black guy, dark blue makeup. I don't know. I copied the paint job off the original Batmobile.
Oh wow!
They were shooting the original Tim Burton Batman, and the Batmobile was parked next door. So I popped down there. They were building Gotham City on the backlot at Pinewood. I'd popped down to the garage because it's still one of my favourite ones from the very first one, because it's got that 50s feel. And I looked at the paint job and said, "This is really nice. What have you done?" And I said, "Well, it's black with about 5 different coats of interference colours over the top." So I did the same paint job on Baphomet. It's a black paint job with then airbrush coats of interference colours, so the lights kick off different colours as they bounce off him. They then covered it in this appallingly blotchy optical that you virtually can't see the thing. Steve Painter is then doing this full life-size one with a head that's about 3 foot high. He's sculpting that in the corner there, so we're working off each other. And it was nice, but we were running a major foam lab there, so there were about 3 people running foam all day. We had a major mould room with about 3 people running mould rooms there. There was just tons and tons and tons of stuff going on. And on top of that, we just sort of said, look, you've got 5 minutes. I had a couple of days where I thought, okay. So I sculpted a head, a weird sort of looking head that was just silly. And I thought, well, we've got to get somebody in there. I don't just want somebody walking around like an old Star Trek alien. So I basically just made a big body stocking in little spare moments. And then I cut loads of bits of foam up, just old bits of foam, and did a spine down the back. Put somebody into it, made them into like a slug with a spine that went down from this thing, and then just made it up. It was like latex and Evo-Stick. If you mix it together, it sets itself. And you hit a hairdryer onto the Evo-Stick and it cobwebs.
Yeah, it turns,
So I did like a rotten flesh slug with a spine going down the back. And you see it in the film, pulling himself along on his arms, just at one shot. And then we would salvage everything we can. We'd sort of like go skip hunting and find old bits of this and bits of that or whatever. And
just to try and meet the demand of the sheer number of creatures, because it's supposed to be medium. This is where all the creatures in the world end up being, isn't it? So
and this is where the problem starts to arise. Well, you see, the thing is that the way I always look upon it, the problem with Nightbreed was there was this triangle. You had Clive Barker. Now, Clive is a genius. No problem with that. He's still doing pretty well, etc., etc. I've been to see him a couple of times in the States, and he was a very, very good friend. unfortunately, his creativity is unlimited. He's the only person I can see. You'll be sitting there talking about a certain project, and you'll be sitting there doing a little illustrated signing on one book, thinking about the next book with this hand or with this half of his brain, and talking about. He's just a genius. He's watching him draw.
It's just this fountain of inspiration constantly,
total.
But then there's no rails at which to guide either.
So you know, in a film, the rails, the guides, are provided by the producer, who says you can't afford to do that, Clive.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the producer, and it's a sort of reasonably well-known story, Christopher Figg, did not guide him. And we were about halfway through the movie, and Clive's mot du jour, shall we say, was basically, we'll do it in post. We'll fix it in post.
And this is pre-CG, so that's quite an undertaking to optically
the thing
repair.
is, and he would come into the workshop, so everyone said, I've had this great idea. I mean, Boone and Baphomet were virtually Boone, the main character, Little John's makeup, was virtually the design. He couldn't lock down the design, and we were about 3 weeks from shooting it.
I've got to make this.
And John had to get. I know that's 3 weeks is a reasonably long time these days, but the thing is, it was just, we were getting worried.
So as soon as the words "I've got a great idea" come up, you know that spells trouble.
And he would come in with a quick drawing and things like that, and he would sketch something out and say, so we were just having. God, we had one woman, we had a person rolling glue, we threw loads of polystyrene beads at them, spray painted it, got them on set. We'd have loads and loads. We'd have an old bit. There's a character with fingers coming out their chins.
Lizzie B, I remember that one in the book.
Loads of stuff. And there was Kate Murray did the elephant head people with the eyes. There was so much stuff. Yeah. Martin Mercer took the Vasti Moses makeup that John had done. The big baldy thing with the little arms, etc., etc. Refigured that into the man that's on the stilts with his legs broken backwards.
Yep.
That's the same. It was just nightmarish, and it got out of control. And they were running out of money, so not New World, Morgan Creek came in and basically sacked Christopher Figg and brought in Martina Gabrielli, this really hotshot American producer. Shuffle here, etc., etc. Brought John Barron in again to sort of sort out the production schedule, and got it online. And then gave them a load more money to go and do those awful reshoots that they shot in the States with some perfectly nice makeup effects by other people, but by this time Cronenberg's hair had grown. And if you look carefully, you'll see his hair change. About 2 inches difference. And that's when they then screwed the movie big time. Because they looked at it. Morgan Creek are the people who... Do you know The Exorcist 3? I mean, a brilliant, brilliant film. But Morgan Creek screwed the ending. Because Morgan Creek, Jim Robinson, who was the producer, our same producer, said to William Peter Blatty, he said, well, where's the exorcism sequence? And they said, Blatty, who was directing it, said, there isn't one. And I love Exorcist 3. I think it's one of the scariest films you'll ever see. Yeah. One of the five scariest films. Very, very creepy stuff. It is just stunning. And then at the end, blam, hell opens up, and you've got the exorcism. That was never meant to be there. Morgan Creek apparently said, look, we want an exorcism, and forced him to have that sequence. Right. So the thing is,
very jarring, considering the sort of psychological kind of creepy build-up and people scuttling across the ceiling.
Brad Dourif in classic form, Yeah. And you watch it in the cinema, and every time when that woman comes out with the shit or chubbies, everybody screams. Yeah. That is the most stunning static camera scene in film history, probably. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, we had the same producer, and he did the same thing. He said, "But Clive, people might like the monsters," and Clive said, "Yes." And he didn't like it. Right. And he said, no, the monsters, the bad guys. And Clive said, no, the monsters are a microcosm of society. They're good, bad, male, female, straight, gay, black, white, blah, blah, everything. But this is the
whole point of Midian.
Of the thing is the monsters are the psychiatrists and the police, the people we might trust the most, saying not they're all bad, but the thing is, this is the reversal of the roles. Yeah. Midian is just simply society. It's just squeezed down into people who look slightly different. Our attitudes towards disability, to sexuality, everything is included in this film. Yeah. And that was the idea of the original script.
And that just didn't get through to the production.
It. Oh, it got through, and they didn't like it. So they trashed it. So they gave Cronenberg more people to kill. They put more blood and guts in and changed the ending. Right. And because now we have Nightbreed, the Cabal cut, that's some way redressed the balance to going back to what it should have been. Sure. To which is a movie about that whatever you look like, whatever you are, that you should be happy with what you are and that you shouldn't be oppressed or whatever because of the way you look. Mm-hmm. And it's a wonderful film to make a point on that level. It's what science fiction fantasy does so well, is to actually make points about the way we live now, the way our attitudes.
Yeah, the great distraction of the visual, which is, a good hook.
And it looks pretty good. Yeah. Overall, we had some big sets. I mean, God, Steve Hardy, that Midian set that was about 3 stories high, that was expanded by a wonderful miniature sequence that most people look at and can't tell the difference between the two when the car goes down through the middle of the thing. And some lovely stuff. Charles Hay doing his gunslinging police sergeant. Cronenberg, actually, I like him every time I see him. I was sort of thinking, he's not an actor when you first saw it, but actually that quiet, underplayed that he
voice.
does.
Yeah.
And because I got to meet him and have lunch with him one day, one of my heroes, he's like, wow. But it was an interesting film to work on. It was tiring.
Yeah.
Because we had it was really about 4, nearly 5 month shoot, and we'd been nearly 8 months in the workshop building up to it. And you mentioned before that whole thing about about working on a stage and working in a workshop. Yeah. Is I always found the thing is that with the pre-production, towards the end of you'd get me on a set. And then towards the end of the shoot, you say, oh, God, next picture, please, into the workshop.
And that was shot at Pinewood, so you geographically, your workshop wouldn't be that far from where you were filming, which is always a joy when that happens. It doesn't always happen, especially nowadays.
I'm trying to think, they were shooting Aliens.
Okay.
Alien 3. Alien 2.
Yeah, Aliens.
Alien 2, yes, Aliens. And they were shooting Alien 3. That's it in 1990 when I finished there, when we were doing Highlander 2. So there was so much of the stuff going on, amalgamated.
What a time to be at Pinewood, man!
Yeah,
You're Batman.
Yeah. And then everybody was there. Gino Acevedo was there working for Amalgamated Dynamics. All the people there, etc., etc. And then lots of our crews, we let them go and walk over to and go and start working there. So there was lots going on. And Pinewood, it still is, but was at that time, those sort of 10 years where it's real big time when they were making big films.
I think those were probably the years that I was at an age where monsters stuff. I always liked monsters and creatures, but that was a time where those things really hit. And I was buying Fangoria magazine, and this is where I found out about image animation through those kinds of comments and seeing articles about that sort of stuff.
But it's also, it's before the advent of CG.
It was. And
whilst I'm not totally anti-CG at all, it's a tool.
Yeah.
When it's used as the tool for the right job, fabulous. But what was it? Jurassic Park '93 was that point where people started to realise that CG was something that you could actually do something. Instead of building a big Tyrannosaurus that wouldn't move and walk along the floor, you could actually do something. Oh,
yeah.
And it's gone beyond that, obviously, where it's just the thing that you go to straight off. But the thing is that we were sort of like working with, Cliff Cully and the opticals, at Pinewood. Mm-hmm. Some of their stuff was fabulous. And their company goes back to the 50s. They were doing matte paintings, watching Cliff matte paint. It's just matte paintings. I remember as a boy, about 18 and 19, I went to a lecture by Albert Whitlock at the National Film Theatre, where he did a full lecture, and he brought along a couple of glass paintings, and then showed you, had a whole show reel that showed the painting, then the holes with the black, and then it fitted into the film with a little optical kicks off for things like earthquake and things like that, which was just fascinating. And I thought, God, I wish I could paint. It was one of those options I was thinking of when I was doing model building and makeup and matte painting, that kind of stuff. And there's a technique to it that people don't realise now with CG matte painting. I'm sure it's quite difficult, but it's all in 3G and 3D, sorry. So you can move around it. When you've got paintings, you look at, remember the fabulous one at the end of, that Pangrazio did at the end of Die Hard with the planes, or the one at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And people these days don't understand that you couldn't hold on a matte painting for more than a couple of seconds without seeing a brushstroke or something, and that you kick something in. But the one at the end of Die Hard is, 15 seconds before it fades out, and little holes where they got people moving, that they shot into it, and you look at it and think, how do you paint, like the ones in Earthquake, how do you paint buildings with straight lines, and you've got your stick and you're doing this and this. People don't get those things these days.
I also think there was a certain amount of, because you didn't have the ability to do anything, if there was enough money you could do anything, there were limitations to things. I think there was a certain amount of acceptance of, like, this is what we're going to film.
Yes.
And you don't change your bloody mind 5 minutes before.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's like, let's build an entire 3D environment because we might want to change our minds later. So that option to always be flexible is always there. And I think that makes for lazy filmmaking in a way, because then people are not prepared to make decisions on set as much.
It's interesting because the thing is that the one thing I hate, all right, I don't hate, but I dislike about lots of modern films that use a lot of CGI environments is it gives the person the ability to fly anywhere they like. And the problem is, somebody actually wrote it down. I said, that's what I've been thinking. Is the thing is that the best stuff is when you shoot it from a human perspective. Mm-hmm. And as people can't go whiz around in circles, etc., it just upsets that sense of reality. And once you've seen a city sort of like being destroyed in 3D, whizzing round it 100 times, it just gets boring. Mm. And what we had to do is we shot it in sections. It takes me back to a thing that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Do you know the one, the TV one?
I do. Carry on. I've got something interesting to show you in a second.
Okay,
carry on. No, it's good. It's
Mr.
good.
Potato Head, as he was called by the Daily Mirror, I think it was. It was an interesting project for, I can't remember the name of the director. The director had done 2 or 3 big TV historical things. And it was for American TV. And the problem with American TV was they like their stuff well lit. They did it those times. Now it's become much more arty and you can get away with darker stuff. Mm. So everything was going to be well lit. And he came to us, and Bob was doing something else. John was doing Chimera, I was doing Dr. Jekyll, I think it was, or something like that.
I remember Chimera.
Yeah, TV thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing this, and we had a budget, minimal budget, and he said, I want to do an uncut transformation. I want to have the camera standing there, just looking at this guy, and he goes, and transforms. And I said...
I mean, the budget for American Werewolf in London was pretty big, and they had cutaways.
Yes. And I said to him, now, you and I both know, to me, you may be the same, the greatest transformation sequence in film history is American Werewolf.
Oh, I was going to think that Lon Chaney, when he, with the light, that was pretty
yes, good. Okay. You go back, and again, I was looking at some stuff online. It's the thing is the Abbott Costello to Frederick March copy that, where you're just using simple dissolves.
Yeah.
And the thing is that, but to me, American Werewolf works, not because it's low budget, but because they use what's called film grammar. They edit. That if I did a shot of you, if this was being filmed, there'd be nothing as boring as watching my head just sitting here talking from the same angle. So you cut to long shots, close-ups, side shots. Yeah. The classic, we now have all those shots of the film of the camera filming the person. Yeah. The long shot, the cuts of films while I'm talking. You've got to keep people interested.
It did. I mean, that was the thing. I mean, the effects on that shot were in American Werewolf, the transformation. They were fantastic, but they were also engaging because it was quite voyeuristic. Because each shot was very carefully selected.
Yes. It was storyboarded.
It was storyboarded, and you felt you were being carried along with it. You were like being exposed to things, like when his hand first elongates.
Yeah. But you never felt
horrendous.
You never felt shortchanged in terms of the effect because you didn't care that you cut.
No.
Now, David, the director, wanted to have one long sequence, and I was saying, look, it's just this brightly lit shot of this man going, it's going back to the old days when we used to do cross dissolves and you could see the eyes move, that kind of thing, which was what they used and what they had. And I said, if you look at American Werewolf, still then, certainly, but I still think now one of the greatest transformations is the thing is you're using sort of like different cutaways and you get tension, etc. And that means we can do cutaways to this and this and this and this. And he said, no, I want that. I don't get, you can afford that, you can afford that. So we came up with an idea. We sat with me, Chris Fitzgerald and John, sat down and came up with this idea that we basically would have Michael Caine standing there in front of camera on a locked-off chair, and he would go, screw his face up, and go, and we would get in a certain point to go, and whip his face across, and that would create a bit of blur.
Right.
So during the point, what I'd say, what we'll try and do is we're going to then do a puppet head of Michael Caine. The thing is that in that position, so we went into Michael's house, we photographed him, Chris Fitzgerald. No, it was John did the Michael Caine head. A gorgeous sculpt of Michael Caine going, like that. And then we'll put bladders in it.
Okay. And
bits and pieces. And I also copied one of Dick Smith's techniques he used for spasms, where you put trichloroethylmethane into foam and it swells.
It swells up, yep.
He did it beautifully in spasms.
Yes.
So we did that. We copied the technique. We didn't do the cuts, but we wanted his face to swell. So we did that on a foam head, and there's me and John underneath, completely covered in polythene to make sure we don't get touched by this stuff, pumping this stuff. The head starts to bulge up in certain places. Then we're going to hand puppeteering this head, going, and stop, then whip again. We'll cut again then to a bladdered head that pops up and blah, 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 all this kind of thing. Then it starts going down a bit, and then we do whip it again. We cut to a Mr. Hyde head with bladders, then a Mr. Hyde head with trichloroethylmethane, and then to the makeup.
Was this in front of like a green screen or
no,
blue
it was
screen?
a dark background,
Dark
just a dark
background.
background in a little corner of a soundstage in Pinewood. And I said, it might work. Because it didn't
That's
work.
the best I can give you.
It didn't work. Because the thing is, it would have taken not a formidable editor, but a good editor and a good effects, sort of like they didn't have the budget for the optical printing, all that kind of thing.
Sure.
And they said, we can't work. And I kept saying that, I said, I don't think this will work, but this is the best idea we've got between me, Chris and John. This is what we think we can do.
Right.
And I was unceremoniously fired from the picture. Just I said, look, just Geoff, Bob said, just I wouldn't come in today, etc., etc. He said they're a bit pissed off, and Bob knew where I was coming from. John sort of said, look, we told them right at the beginning we're not sure this will work. This is the best we can do for this budget. They then gave them another 20 grand, and they went back and did it exactly the way I said they should have done it in the first place. With cutaways. So bladders on hands, bladders on faces, bits and pieces. Some of our puppet heads thrown in there, lots of cuts, and it made a perfectly reasonable sequence for the transformation.
Yeah.
And had they done it the way we said that in the first place, they'd have got a bloody amazing transformation sequence. And there was then, and that was a nice film to shoot on. It was great to work with Michael Caine, etc., etc. The makeup was interesting. I tried to do something different. I went for a baby. I said, if the guy's being reborn,
he could be a baby.
We gave him baby teeth, we gave him baby hands, sort of like stumpy hands, and this thing that came out looking like a potato head, which you have a picture of, obviously.
I think I've got. I'll tell you, it came out in the newspaper.
Yes.
I think the Mirror and the Sun.
The Mirror did a cartoon and called it Mr. Potato Head or something because he looked like Mr. Potato Head.
Somewhere. I hope it is anyway.
It worked quite nicely. It wasn't awful, but it was interesting.
Yeah, it was all new.
And I didn't want to do, the Frederick March Mr. Hyde is classic, but I always thought, why did he change into virtually a gorilla? My favourite Mr. Hyde is the Spencer Tracy.
Oh my God.
Do you know that one?
Yeah.
Because that's subtle, and that when Spencer Tracy's in that makeup,
the light change thing.
It's the light change thing. With the shadows and the different coloured makeups, but then minimal prosthetics. And when he leers, and he's got the same teeth, that's the one. Yeah. And it's just, we tried to get a babyish look to it, and it was interesting. But, to me, it's with the lenses and that, we give him big baby eyes, etc., and he's got an interesting look to it.
Yeah.
And I thought it worked quite nicely. And with his performance in it, was fabulous. He had a nasty look, a misshapen baby type look.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's just sort of like that it was in full light all the time, and it was a standard TV soap opera costume drama type thing. And whilst there were some good bits to it, it just didn't really do that much. But, yeah.
It's a shame. Sometimes it happens.
Yeah.
You put everything into it and,
totally.
Nothing happens. And other times you do something off cuff and it ends up being a hit and you can't know.
I know we did the best job we could. Chris Fitzgerald did some gorgeous sculpts for the sort of the middle stages, and we all came up with the idea between us, and we all said, look, this is what we did. We did the best we could, and we know that the one of the other producers came to us afterwards and said, look, I'll let you in a little secret. David rang up ILM after he finished because he was so miffed apparently that we'd spent £50,000 of his money on the transformation.
How much
that
do
didn't
you
work.
think they charge me?
And he rang up ILM and they said, well, basically 50 grand you probably gets to come over for the day and talk to you about it. He said, for a transformation like that, if you wanted it straight through with all the opticals, you'd be looking $1 million minimum. And he said David suddenly thought, perhaps it
That was a bit harsh.
No, of course not. No, directors don't.
So you didn't get any wine through the post, like.
So it doesn't. I've done enough stuff now where you always want to do your best. If you do a job, what's the point in not doing your best?
Yeah, quite right.
Then the thing is, it's that simple.
So that's it for the first part. Part 2, like I say, will be up next week. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to us on iTunes or any podcast directory and keep the feed going so you don't miss anything. Also, just to remind you that we'd love to hear from you. Feedback is always welcome, and normally we're looking at solutions to problems. We've done an interview this time around, but normally we're just looking at how to fix problems that crop up, hence the podcast being called Battles with Bits of Rubber, because that's pretty much what we do. So if you do have any technical questions or anything you want to hear, maybe even feature as a podcast episode, because if we get good questions, which we often do, it's nice to include them in the podcast, and maybe even something that we'll include with video or a tutorial or something as well, because if you've got that question, there's a good chance somebody else somewhere will have the same question, and it's good to find out these things and share your experiences. Our email is stuartandtodd@gmail.com. So we've had a couple of good questions. We've answered a lot in email form, but there's a fair few that I think are probably worth sharing. So I'm just going to read out a few here. We've got one from Michelle Pennington. I think that's right. Is it Michael or Michelle Pennington? He writes, "Hello, Stuart and Todd. That was a great podcast on life casting. I have one quick question. I understand the need for accurate life cast, but other than removing bubbles, fixing nostrils and other imperfections, why is it that we have to shave down the cast piece? Shouldn't things be super accurate when they're done? If there can be these discrepancies, where do they come from? Can it be so truly different to the point that the prosthetic doesn't fit?" I'm answering some of these questions in my head, but I would like to know a little bit more so I can either avoid it or minimize it or learn through some other processes. Okay, that's a very good question, Michelle, and basically I have replied to him in the email, but I wanted to just chat about it as well, because I think it's a good question. It's something that crops up a lot sometimes when people are dealing with a face cast, and there are things you do to it. And I do actually appreciate it, Michelle, that you took the time to get in touch. I say shaving down, that would suggest that like a wholesale smoothing of the whole surface, like you're trying to smooth it all down to like a billiard ball kind of smoothness. And you're correct that the whole point in taking a life cast is to record as accurate a copy of the body part or face, whatever, as possible. And often there are these artifacts which you unintentionally create through air bubbles in the alginate or seam lines if you've done a back and a half, two pieces of a cast, you end up with a seam line. And these inaccuracy or these artifacts, they were never part of the person, but they were acquired incidentally through the casting process. So that's why those need to be gotten rid of. But the main artifacts, I think, that you'll come across with life casting are things like the bulge of hair underneath the ball cap, because obviously when you've got your plaster head out, this will appear as a solid lump of plaster. Yet real hair would crush flat and smooth if you pressed it down, but obviously during the casting process you're sort of putting material on, it's kind of hanging off, so that often doesn't really happen. So we usually measure the head circumference with a tailor's tape to measure, and then we know the dimensions of the head with the hair flattened down. So then often what will happen is you'll shave back the plaster head to make sure it is the correct size of the head and not the size of the volume of hair in plaster, which can be much bigger than the actual head underneath. The caveat of that is that on occasion you do sometimes shrink cores down, especially bodies or limbs, to make a piece really snug. Often, especially with silicone, because silicone stretches so well, but it doesn't compress great. But it does readily stretch. It's often a good idea to actually make the thing smaller than you need so that it's tight, so that it has a better fit and doesn't appear baggy. Kind of like how Lycra or spandex compression tops, they always look very, very small when you see them on the hangers, but actually when you put them on, because they stretch so much, they'll fit. And it's kind of like that with a lot of silicone things. Typically things like masks or suits where it's like a big one-piece thing because you have to stretch it so much to get it on. If you actually make it the size of the head, by the time you've done that, it tends to be a little bit baggy because it stretches so much. So often you will shave a head down or actually reduce the core. Maybe you lay some clay inside the mold so that when the head comes out, it's actually slightly smaller than the original head. So the features and everything are the same, but the actual volume of the head, or maybe the circumference of the neck is reduced so that the piece is then smaller. So that the final silicone piece then pops on is actually a snug fit. And it just looks better and it moves better because it's actually, clinging to the skin rather than, sitting on there like a big baggy sack. We have another great question from a guy called Mark Petrie. So thank you, Mark, for getting in touch. Mark says, "Hi there. I'm a complete novice to sculpting and I have been watching your skin texturing video over and over again. I bought some Prima Plastiline from the sculpture house, but the clay seems to be much too soft to create those really fine details that you're showing in your video. The clay seems quite sticky. I was expecting it to be more like a wax, but it's definitely not that. It says that it's a medium hardness, but I think the plastiline that you used in your video is a medium hardness. Anyway, it's too warm in my home, maybe where I'm trying to work. Do you think I should use a harder clay if I'm working in a warmer environment? I wouldn't know because I'm in England and it's never warm here. That's not true. I think basically the answer to that is yes. If you're finding, because plastilines are by definition waxy, oily materials, they tend to soften with heat. So if where you are happens to be warm, you work in a warm workshop or a warm environment, then it's going to soften the plastiline. So regardless of what they're calling it, because obviously the name, medium, hard, whatever, is kind of subjective. There isn't necessarily a kind of a strict guideline as to what things are going to be called. So what might be, medium someplace may be hard to somebody else, or if they've got sort of weaker fingers or something. So it kind of depends on, variables. So I would take all that with a pinch of salt, really. What I would say is that it's probably worth you actually handling materials. I know you're going to find suppliers online are cheaper, typically, but that denies you the opportunity of actually handling a material if you're not familiar with it. So I would urge you to try and go to either trade shows or to stores where they actually sell it and actually sort of get your hands on these things and squeeze them and work them, get a ball of it in your hands and try and work it and see how it looks and how it feels, so that you have a very realistic idea of how it works for you, because it's going to be different to different people. The clay that I like to use, or the plastiline I like to use, is stuff called it's made by J. Herbin, Herbin. I can put a link to it in the blog post details. But basically, it's and in the show notes, it's basically a grey. Well, it comes in grey and ivory, but I tend to get the grey because the ivory shows up every bit of dirt and grease, that your fingers pink up in a workshop. I tend to work with the grey, and I work with a grade called 55. They do a 50 and a 55. I think they go down to 45, which is the softest, and it goes up to about 70, 75, I think, which is the hardest. Anything above 55 I find is too firm for me to work. So I tend to work with, a softer plastiline if I can. There are, of course, one of the most well-known clays that we use is called Monster Clay. Well, I really like Monster Clay. I think it's really, really nice. And they've recently brought out, I think, 3 different hardnesses now. So there's a firm, a medium, and a soft. And I think it was always available in the medium range that they have. But I have found, particularly in colleges where we're working with people who are a bit younger, or they just don't have the finger strength because they're not, rock climbers or whatever, or they don't sculpt all the time. But they have found that working with Monster Clay as the standard grade was quite firm. I quite like it, and I like the firmness of it. But some people found it too firm to work. And I know that you can heat it up in a microwave, but it cools very quickly, especially if you're working on plaster, because as soon as you put the molten material onto your core to start sculpting, it cools again and returns to its normal state. So if you want something that is softer, it makes sense to get a softer plastiline. But if you are working in a warm environment and you're finding the softness is so soft that you can't actually get the detail that you want, especially the finer detail, then it's worth switching to a firmer plastiline. I think that's one of the good things about Monster Clay, that they really have that advantage, being a firmer kind of clay. I mean, you can melt it to liquid to brush it in and pour it into molds, but once it kind of cools and goes a lot harder, you can really work it up, quite fiercely, and you get a much different finish, especially for the finer detail. So for that kind of stuff, it's really, really good. So I would check out maybe Monster Clay as well if you can't find something easily. It also depends where you are. I mean, I found in Europe, England and stuff, the Herbin stuff is quite popular and well known. Outside of that area, especially in the States, it tends to be harder. You get a lot more Chavant and Monster Clay use, because that's just what you can get your hands on easily. So I would say yes for you, definitely, Mark. It might be worth trying out just a firmer plastiline, see if you can get something that's a bit firmer. So thanks very much for your emails and questions. I love to hear from you. Please do get in touch. Like I say, our email address again is stuartandtodd@gmail.com. And just to mention the last podcast we did, which was all about the colouring, silicone colouring, that is a tie-in with an article that we wrote for the Prosthetics Magazine, which is out now, issue number 3. It's worth checking out Prosthetics Magazine if you can. There's a Facebook group, just called Prosthetics Magazine. Check it out. It's got loads of stuff in it. It comes out maybe 4 or 5 times a year. The reason it doesn't come out that often is because the idea is to just pack it with stuff. So each time it comes out, it's filled with stuff. It's not just padding, to fulfill like a weekly or monthly schedule. It's actually released when there's a decent amount of stuff coming out, so it's well worth checking out. So hopefully I shall speak to you soon. Please, like I say, get in touch, and thank you very much for listening.